Hello, everyone, and welcome to Needy No More, the podcast dedicated to healing the anxious attachment style. I'm your host, author, and anxious attachment style coach, Chris Rackliffe. I've helped thousands of people across 6 continents to end the cycle of anxious attachment through my workshops, my books, my digital downloads, and my 12-week coaching program. I am honored to continue on that mission here in this podcast. I'll be sharing principles and practices, techniques and tools for you to explore on your journey to growing more secure. Welcome to the very first episode of the podcast. This is very special for me. I have been a guest on many a podcast, but this is my very own show, and I'm really excited to share my knowledge with you and chat with you and share everything I've learned about healing the anxious attachment style. There are a few things I want to cover in this first episode, so let's go through them. First things first, I want to share a little bit more about who I am. You might be wondering, who the hell is this Chris Rackliffe guy? You may be familiar with me from TikTok or my website, crackliffe.com. You might have seen me on Instagram. Maybe you've heard me or seen me on one of those guest podcast appearances that I have done. But I want to share a little bit more about my story so you understand why I got into doing this, why I'm even here. From there, I do want to talk about why I named the podcast Needy No More. What does that even mean? I want to talk about the word needy because I look at it as a 5-letter word, a derogatory term, something we should not be using, either about other people or about ourselves. From there, I'm going to back up. I'm going to talk about attachment theory. When did it start? What is the goal of attachment theory? Maybe this is the first time you've ever heard of it, or maybe you're familiar with it from the cultural conversation or the zeitgeist, but you want to know a little bit more about it and why people are so interested in it. We'll talk about the 4 attachment styles, including, but especially the anxious one. That's where I focus because that's what I struggled with for many years. And I'm coaching from my own experience, healing and growing more secure. We'll also talk about the cycle of anxious attachment, give you a little preview on what the episodes to come are going to focus on. And that's a lot of ground to cover. So without further ado, let's go ahead and dive in. So who am I? Who is this Chris Rackliffe character sitting in front of you that you're either watching or listening to? Well, let's start at the beginning. My parents divorced when I was just 2 years old. I was living in San Antonio, Texas at the time. That's where I was born and where I was raised until I was 2 years old when my parents split. Now, from there, my parents shared custody. My mom originally had custody, and then my dad got custody of me and my sister, Michelle, because of some circumstances that happened with my mom. When I was about 5 years old, my sister sexually abused me. She touched me inappropriately, and I was molested. I know a lot of people out there can relate to that. That's obviously something deeply personal, but I share that so that other people understand there's multiple forms of abandonment and trauma and abuse. And that was certainly one for me, being betrayed by my own sister, who was 9 years my senior. So I was 5 and she was 14 at the time. When I was 8 years old, my mom ended up moving to Florida with her second husband. She had remarried a man named Mr. Bill, and he got a job in Florida. And so they relocated from Maryland, where all of us were living at the time. And my parents were sharing custody. We'd go back and forth kind of every other weekend. So I went from seeing my mom about 2 to 3 times a month to 2 to 3 times a year. What was a half-hour to 45-minute car ride became a 2.5-hour plane ride. So that was obviously really tough and a form of emotional abandonment. At 8 years old, I was left bewildered, very confused, feeling let go, abandoned by my own mom, like I was discarded. And I stayed in that cycle from the ages of 8 to 18. That was really tough. That was 10 years, 10 formulative years of my life that I spent going back and forth, feeling stuck in the middle between my parents. And I loved my mom. I adored her. She adored me. And I'm using the past tense because when I was 18, she did pass away. She died from organ failure. She was an alcoholic and her addiction consumed her. And so at that age, at 18, I had just started college, went to college at the University of Miami. Part of the reason I even chose to go there was to be closer to my mom because I felt like I'd been robbed of the opportunity to have a relationship with her, a real relationship with her, something in person. And then at the end of my very first semester of college, she passed. And then the abandonment was actualized. It wasn't just emotional, it was physical. So that was incredibly tough. And in the aftermath of that, my sister Michelle and I, the same one who sexually abused me 13 years prior, we grieved very differently. My go-tos were alcohol and sex. I was 18. I was still exploring my body and discovering who I was. I just started college. And so the things that I was exploring at that age became my crutches, things that I leaned on in my healing journey to process the loss. But that ended up becoming my coping mechanisms du jour, if you will. My sister was different. Michelle relied on drugs and criminal behavior. She acted out. Part of that had to do with the fact that when she was 13, so the year before she sexually abused me, my mom, in a drunken stupor, told Michelle that Brett, who was my biological father, was actually not her biological father. That wrecked Michelle, and she started acting out, including, the experience of molestation with me. And from there, things just spiraled. She ended up in foster care and in a juvenile jail. And I have glimpses of this period where I would go and see her, and there would be, monitors, a social worker, a guard there that were present. And that was incredibly, incredibly tough. But for Michelle, after our mom passed, because her biological father had already passed, she never got to know him. The loss of Linda, our mom, was so tough for her. She had no parents left. And at the time, she was 27 years old. So she ended up relying on the same coping mechanisms that she had from 13 until that point, until 27, acting out, sex, criminal behavior, drugs. And ultimately, we ended up drifting to the point where our relationship no longer existed. I mean, it got to the point where Michelle was essentially only talking to me when she needed money from me. And you know, I was in my 20s and wasn't making a ton of money and had nothing to give her, basically. I was living in New York City at the time and basically broke. So we just became estranged. And unfortunately, a few years later, Michelle passed away as well from addiction. And so suddenly, three generation of women on my mom's side, my mom's mom, my mom, and my sister all passed from addiction. And that was a huge wake up call for me. And something that I still hold in my heart to this day. I don't want to die. I didn't want to lose myself in substances or experiences in the same way that those women had. I wanted to break the generational trauma of my family. Now, there were some other things that happened that I'll briefly go into with my dad, who raised me essentially as a single parent. He was my rock. He was a provider to the core. However, being, a white heterosexual male of a certain generation, he also wasn't incredibly emotionally intelligent. He never really learned how to be with his feelings. And so when I had very big feelings, and me being the sensitive, big-hearted person that I was and am, he didn't know how to be with that. So I had a roof over my head, I had food, I had clothes, I had everything I needed. We didn't want for anything necessarily. I had the basics. We didn't have much, but I had what I needed. My needs were met at a very basic level. But that said, emotionally, he didn't know how to regulate his own feelings, let alone mine. So that led to an environment where I felt distant from my mom physically, and I felt very distant from my dad emotionally. My mom always doted on me emotionally. I never doubted her love for me, and I never doubted my father's love for me either. But things got really tough when I was 14 years old and came out of the closet as a gay man. And he was not accepting at first. And we struggled for a few years from when I was 14 until I was 17, when he had a stroke that almost killed him. And I was the one who found him and called 911 and essentially saved his life. I'm not patting myself on the back for that by any means, but you know, without me being there, he likely would have lost his life. And that changed things. The year later, when my mom passed, he was there and, he vowed to be there for Michelle and I and show us the love that he knew our mom had for us. It broke down a lot of the walls that he had built up internally that really fell away in the wake of almost losing his life. Mortality can do that to you. It really shows you what matters and it puts things into perspective. Fast forwarding a little bit here, Brett, my father, also passed away 3 years ago now in 2022 from complications after a heart transplant, which was a long road that originally started with that stroke when I was 17. So that said, now essentially all the people that were in the hospital room when my mom, Linda, passed are gone. My mom, my sister, my dad, Mr. Bill even passed from cancer. While I don't share this to get any pity or sympathy from anyone, I want people to know I have struggled and I have been there. I've been through a considerable amount of trauma, enough so that it could have derailed my life. And I think you can tell based on how eloquent I am and how I speak and how I hold myself that I'm not attached to these events anymore. I'm not attached to the label of anxious attacher or experiencing anxious attachment anymore. I do consider myself secure based on the work that I have done. And discovering my attachment style was a life-changing experience for me. It really was a watershed moment. I wouldn't be here talking to you if it hadn't happened. And that to me is the power of attachment theory. It's not some sort of holy grail. It can't, make sense of everything that happened to you. But for me, looking back at the experiences that I just shared with you, and then looking at how I was showing up in my dating life in my 20s in New York City and things just weren't clicking, it started to make sense, right? Like the origins of everything, that's what attachment theory can help you to understand. It can't make sense of everything. Not everything in life fits into some sort of neat, tidy box with a ribbon and a bow on it. But it did help me to see the connection between my upbringing and how I was showing up in my adult relationships. And that was a game changer for me. It really helped me to validate myself and to understand I'm not the only person in the world who struggles with this. I'm not the only anxious attacher out there. For years, I literally thought I was crazy. I thought I was defective. Shame is something that we as anxious attachers struggle with very deeply. This idea that we're not good enough or that we're too much or both. It works in both directions. But at the end of the day, attachment theory helped me to see I'm not alone in this. I'm not the only one. And that my experience and struggles were connected to experiences and struggles that I had that made my nervous system and my body feel a certain way. And so, of course, based on that conditioning, I was going to show up in my adult relationships a certain way. Of course, I was going to be, smothering and constantly desiring validation and reassurance and losing sleep over whether or not someone felt the same way about me as I did about them, or stalking someone on social media, wondering why they hadn't responded to my messages. If you're listening to this and you're an anxious attacher, please know you are not alone. And I have been there. I have been in the thick of it, and you don't have to continue to struggle. And my whole purpose in being a coach and an author and now a podcaster and doing everything that I'm doing professionally in my life now, dedicating my life professionally to this, I'm going to share with you everything I've learned about attachment theory and specifically anxious attachment and how to heal it. Because I just want to be the healing companion I wish I would have had on my own healing journey. I spent a lot of years reading a lot of books, doing a lot of therapy, looking in a lot of different directions in disparate places. I want to consolidate all of that for you. And that's what I've done in my book, Needy No More. That's what I've done in my coaching program, Needy No More. That's what I'm going to do here as well in the podcast version of Needy No More. It's all Needy No More. So, with that said, let's talk a little bit about why I named the podcast that. Why Needy No More? At the end of the day, I think it might come across as you shouldn't be needy anymore or something like that. But that's not how I intend it. Needy no more means you're not needy and you never were, and you need to stop saying that about yourself. You are no longer needy because you never were in the first place. So, no more are we going to be using that label and applying it to what are incredibly valuable and attractive qualities for you to possess. Okay, so you have a big heart. Okay, so you're a sensitive person. You have big feelings. You have big needs in a relationship. That's not an issue. It's not an issue so long as you stop telling yourself that it is. And so long as you stop believing other people when they tell you or show you that it is, or you interpret their behavior as showing you that. Needy no more means no more are we using the word needy to describe our needs. Are you needy? No, we all have emotional needs, even if they look different. And that's what attachment theory can help us to understand, is that needs can and oftentimes will look very different from person to person. With that in mind, I'm going to go ahead and transition into talking about attachment theory. So, what is attachment theory? Attachment theory is a branch of psychology that was started in the 1950s and 1960s. There were some initial researchers or founders of the theory, such as John Bowlby and Mary Ainsworth, who studied children and how they responded to uncertain or unfamiliar environments. Sound familiar? We all know, as anxious attachers or disorganized attachers leaning anxious, that uncertainty is very challenging for us. And that is what causes us oftentimes to behave in the ways that we do, to really lean in, if you will. And we'll get into that in a moment. So, attachment theory started in the 50s and 60s with those initial researchers. And they conducted a series of experiments, of tests that they called the strange situation test. And in this test, they separated children from their parents or caregivers, and then they monitored how those children responded. Based on their research, they discovered that there were some pretty firm lanes or differences between how certain children responded. And that was the origin, that was the beginning of the attachment styles, which are as follows: anxious, avoidant, disorganized, and secure. Now, that's how I will refer to them. That doesn't mean that those are the only names for those attachment styles. In fact, anxious attachers can be called preoccupied or ambivalent. Avoidant attachers can be called dismissive. Disorganized attachers can sometimes be called anxious avoidant with a hyphen, a combination of the two. Can sometimes be called fearful avoidant, and also, of course, disorganized. I like the one word labels here. So you've got anxious, avoidant, disorganized. But again, that's not how they'll always be referred to. Secure is, you will always hear secure referred to as secure. Now let's unpack what this means. Attachment theory is actually a spectrum from insecure to secure. And the first three attachment styles, anxious, avoidant, and disorganized, are on the insecure side of the attachment spectrum. Secure is on the secure side. I say this because it's important to note that no one is 100% secure and no one is 100% insecure. No one is fully anxious or fully avoidant. We all have degrees of security that we can access within us based on the experiences that we've been through, going all the way back to some of our earliest ones with our parents and our caregivers. That is where a lot of our attachment related conditioning comes from. That's where we learn how to form bonds or build relationships with other people. Now, does that mean that it always goes back to childhood for people? No, it does not. It does not. And I would say for probably maybe 10 to 15% of the people that I've spoken to, it doesn't. They really do feel very confidently that they had stable, healthy environments growing up, that they had healthy behaviors modeled for them. The other 85 to 90% of folks, now they have experienced some degree of childhood trauma, some degree of abandonment or abuse or neglect or disconnection. And while I'm not going to unpack that in today's episode, I will in future episodes. I'm going to dedicate an upcoming episode to talking about trauma and to talking about multiple steps in the cycle of anxious attachment. But the 4 styles, let's unpack them a little bit more so you can understand kind of the primary strategies and tactics that each style uses in their approach to relationships. Let's start with anxious, because obviously that was my struggle for many years. And those are the people that I tend to work with. I'm an anxious attachment style coach. So let's start with anxious attachment. Anxious attachers fear abandonment. That is by far the biggest fear that we experience. That is because typically we've experienced abandonment in our past. There's abandonment trauma. Remember that abandonment doesn't just have to be physical. It can be emotional. It can be a parent who dismissed you and told you to go to your room when you were crying and not to come out until you were finished. It can be a parent who just isn't plugged in to how you're feeling, isn't attuned, to use the psychological term here, to your feelings, who doesn't sit with you through the discomfort, who doesn't model emotional regulation for you. Many of us as anxious attachers never experienced that. Our strategy is to lean in, try harder, overexert, to fix. And we tend to be fixers and pursuers. And we tend to look at, especially romantic partners and a romantic relationship, as saviors. So we're looking to save someone because we think that they can save us, that they'll finally show up and choose us in the ways that we were not chosen previously. But the overall strategy of an anxious attacher is overexert, try harder. If you don't hear from someone, hey, did I do something wrong? That is anxious attachment at its core. What can I do? What do I need to change in order to make this work? On that note, as anxious attachers, we're typically the last to leave. We typically get left first. That's tough to admit. Okay. I know that because I, for many years, did not leave first. I stayed in it through thick and thin, even if I was not being treated properly or in a healthy relationship. And that is problematic. When you're abandoning yourself in that way, which we as anxious attachers do, we become codependent. We're so enmeshed with that person that it becomes our identity, this relationship romantically. And so that's the anxious attachment style in a nutshell. Avoidant attachers are the complete opposite. Whereas anxious attachers need a lot of closeness, a lot of reassurance, and they try harder. Avoidant attachers need a lot of space, a lot of autonomy, a lot of independence, and they tend to disengage and dismiss. That's why one of the other names for an avoidant attacher is dismissive avoidant. So for an avoidant, they reach a certain level of emotional vulnerability and they need to check out. Their system literally shuts down. They cannot access their emotions. Similar to anxious attachers, they never learned how to regulate their emotions or to really be with them. And their strategy is to shut down because they get overwhelmed. So they go inside, they go insular, whereas anxious attachers go external. So that's why they're so opposing. And I'll do an episode on the anxious avoidant relationship. Don't you worry. I know it's one of the primary dynamics that we as anxious attachers experience, and it can be deeply painful. But that said, for now, we can just acknowledge that the anxious and the avoidant attachers' needs and core beliefs are completely opposite. The avoidant attacher looks at themselves as kind of a lone wolf. They are deeply afraid of losing themselves in a relationship. They find neediness to be very, very unattractive. They view autonomy and independence and self-reliance as the pinnacle of relationships. That's the pinnacle of achievement. Whereas an anxious attacher looks at a romantic partnership, a stable relationship as the pinnacle of achievement. And that's because we've been robbed of that experience oftentimes of having a connection with folks who really chose us and showed up for us fully, who really cared about us and were plugged into how we felt. So those are the opposites. Disorganized attacher, or fearful avoidant or anxious avoidant attacher, experiences both extremes of anxious and avoidant attachment. So from 1 second, 1 minute, 1 hour, one day to the next, they might really, really feel very deeply that they might be abandoned. And so they really lean into their relationship and they need a lot from their partner. And they are overexerting themselves trying to, fix the relationship. And then they'll go to the other extreme where they'll just shut down, disappear. They don't know how to engage. They don't know how to feel their feelings. And so this is a world of duality for the disorganized attacher. They are like a box of chocolates, I say. You never know what you're quite going to get. And from, again, day to day to hour, they're going to differ extremely in what they need from you. Disorganized attachers are the most unpredictable to be with because you just truly never know, and neither do they, by the way, what it is that they're going to need or what mood they might be in. And so that can bring a lot of volatility to a relationship. Secure attachers know how to have a healthy relationship both with themselves and with other people. They generally know how to be with their feelings. It doesn't absolve them from any feelings of anxiety or worry or doubt or fear, but it does mean that they know how to be with those feelings. And more specifically, they know that they will always pass, that they're not going to, feel that way forever. They lean on their support system. They're what I call emotionally diversified. And so they know how to hold this sense of self and they know how to hold their connections with others. They have balance in their lives. There's not this extreme duality like the disorganized attacher. And they're not at one extreme or the other of being so dependent on others that they become codependent, like an anxious attacher, or so independent to the point where their connections go nowhere, like the avoidant attacher. They know how to be somewhere in the middle here. They know how to hold both. They've found a center of gravity within themselves, and they're allowing themselves to have healthy connections and relationships with other people. They've learned how to manage that. This is ultimately the goal of what attachment theory offers, is growing more secure, of learning how to establish a healthier relationship with yourself and with other people. It's never one or the other. Please, please, please know that. Okay, that's our overview of attachment theory and attachment styles. Obviously, the goal of you being here is to grow more secure. You want to be needy no more. And so I do want to talk about why I look at needy as a derogatory term. And I'm going to pull up that chapter from my book and read it to you. Before I do, I just want you to know that you're not alone, okay? Every single anxious attacher I have ever worked with looks at themselves as needy or has looked down on themselves or has berated themselves, criticized themselves, judged themselves for feeling deeply. It has to stop. That is what Needy No More is all about. Okay, so the chapter from my book, it is called The Five-Letter Word, and it's from, again, my book, Needy No More, which is exclusively available on Amazon. Here we go. John Bowlby, the British psychiatrist and founder of attachment theory, said, quote, "We're only as needy as our unmet needs," end quote. So why, as anxious attachers, do we beat ourselves up for those needs? Why do we call ourselves needy for wanting clarity, communication, and connection? All fundamental factors that make a relationship not only survive, but thrive. Why do we feel guilty and ashamed of asking for what we know will make us feel appreciated, understood, and heard? I'll tell you why. It's because we've become accustomed to not having our needs met. It's because we've had more than our fair share of roller coaster relationships. It's because we don't truly believe we deserve stability. Upon reading this quote from Bowlby, many anxious attachers will automatically recall memories where others failed to meet their needs. As an anxious attacher yourself, you might remember a situation with an avoidant. You might think back on relationships with folks who turned out to be emotionally unavailable. You might also reflect on people you've met through the years whom you felt were terrible at texting or poor communicators. These are all natural experiences to revisit in the context of this quote. In fact, as we begin to heal, it's often beneficial to recategorize our own role in previous romantic relationships in a more compassionate light. Instead of beating ourselves up for our emotional needs, we can recognize that what we were asking for was reasonable and legitimate, that our needs are valid and still are. As I often remind clients, you can be the total package, but if you're at the wrong address, it won't make any difference. When there's misalignment when it comes to needs and values, love languages, and attachment styles, you're bound to feel unappreciated and you'll likely feel needy as a result. While it's natural that our minds will automatically recount our experiences with others, as they were typically some of our most painful, there's one person in particular whom you might immediately overlook when thinking about not having your needs met. One person who you might not realize actually holds all the power. And that person is you. As anxious attachers, we often fail to realize just how capable and powerful we truly are. We project that power onto others, placing them on a pedestal and expecting them to meet all of our needs. This is codependency. When we're in a codependent bond, we lose ourselves. We become consumed by a romantic relationship. We stop meeting our own needs and externalize them instead, and we feel needy, clingy, and smothering as a result. The word needy is a derogatory term, a 5-letter word we should all refrain from using. It's baffling to me how many people are quick to apply this label to someone sensitive and caring, to someone who feels deeply. In the context of the Bowlby quote above, it's also a shocking admission of guilt. If someone is only as needy as their unmet needs, then to call someone needy means you're admitting that you can't, won't, or don't want to meet their needs, and indeed that you aren't meeting them. The only person who will call you needy is someone who doesn't understand their own emotional needs. Because to be human means to have emotional needs, even if those needs are in direct opposition to those of another. Desiring space instead of closeness is still a need. Craving self-sufficiency instead of reliance on others is still a need. Wanting less from someone instead of wanting more is still a need. Oftentimes, we criticize ourselves for being needy since we neither understand nor respect those needs, and therefore consider them to be too much. This is clearly neither productive nor helpful. In the end, all emotional needs are relative because they happen in the context of relating with others. That means there's always another way of looking at your needs, another perspective to take that doesn't require us to be riddled with self-criticism or self-judgment. So instead of assuming that you're needy, let's try looking at this a few different ways. Are you needy, or does that person not understand their own emotional needs? And so they think you have too many. Are you needy, or is what you're asking for basic human decency and what makes a relationship work, like communication, clarity, and connection? Are you needy, or does your partner lack the capacity or willingness to meet your needs? Are you needy, or are they unable or unwilling to be present with your feelings? Are you needy, or are you self-abandoning? Oof, that's a big one. Take a few moments to consider why you feel needy. You might just see that there's a healthier way of looking at your situation. Your needs matter and they are valid. Stop self-abandoning by convincing yourself that what you're asking for is too much. Stop tolerating the invalidation of others who call you needy as a convenient deflection. One person's "that's too much" is another person's "that's all you need." One person's "you're being needy" is another person's "I'd be happy to do that for you, babe." One person's "I don't have time for that" is another person's "I know how important this is to you and I'll make time for it." Ironically, the more we hear the latter instead of the former, the less we actually need others. This is the essence of the dependency paradox. The more someone meets our emotional needs, the less we depend on them, and the less needy and more secure we feel too. Relax more deeply into the truth of who you are. You'll never be at peace if you're constantly at war with yourself. Stop fighting against what makes you feel supported, appreciated, and connected in relationships. Stop diminishing what's important to you. Stop calling yourself needy. Let it become a forbidden 5-letter word in your vocabulary. All right, folks, as we wrap up today's inaugural episode of the Needy No More podcast, I want to close by talking about the cycle of anxious attachment. It is something that I refer to with a little graphic in the book Needy No More on page 73. It's right here. And you can see there's a cycle of trauma, codependency, and abandonment on the outside, and then a cycle of addiction, dysregulation, and stress on the inside. So again, that is on the outside, the main cycle consisting of trauma, abandonment, and codependency, and an inner cycle of dysregulation, stress, aversion, and addiction. These are the core experiences of the cycle of anxious attachment. If you want to break this cycle, you need to address these experiences. And so that's what we're going to talk about in the coming episodes. Part of why breaking out of the cycle can be so confusing is because all of these concepts blend into one another. Abandonment is a form of trauma. Codependency is a form of self-abandonment and a form of trauma involving others. Dysregulation results from trauma and abandonment and codependency. Dysregulation means that we don't know how to be with stress, so we are averse to it. We don't know how to be with that uncertainty and that discomfort. And that often leads to us engaging in addictive behaviors. In fact, many people don't know this, but anxious attachment is also called love addiction. And we'll unpack these steps in the coming episodes. But I wanted to close by talking about that because I want to acknowledge that many of us have gone through this again and again and again, from one relationship to the next, going all the way back sometimes to the first ones that we had with our parents. And so this programming, this conditioning can feel very deeply rooted. And you might feel that you'll never evolve out of it. You're always going to repeat this. You're doomed to be with emotionally unavailable people until the day you die. No, you're not. No, you are not. You can break this cycle, and I am living proof. And so are the clients I've worked with all over the world. Do they still experience anxiety? Do they still get triggered? Yes, of course they do. But they learn how to be with that. They learn to reassociate with the body and learn what it's trying to tell them. And they honor themselves. They speak up for what they need. They set boundaries. They do all the things that we're going to talk about in the episodes to come that I will share with you. I'm going to brain dump everything I know about anxious attachment and healing it in this podcast. And I cannot wait to keep going. Some resources for folks as we end today's episode. First, I've got a ton of free content on my website, crackliffe.com. That's cracklife with 2 F's.com, CRACKLIFFE.com. There's a ton of blogs like 7 ways to heal the anxious attachment style, 12 ways to make an anxious avoidant relationship work, the boundary setting guide for anxious attachers, breakup tips for anxious attachers, you name it, it's there. So go and consume that content if you haven't already. Now, if you're interested in coaching, go to crackliffe.com/coaching. That will detail my 12-week coaching program of the same name, Needy No More, and you can set up a free consultation with me there. Needy No More, the book, you can get on Amazon or by going to crackliffe.com, crackliffe.com/needy, NEEDY. That will automatically redirect you to the book on Amazon, which is available in paperback, Kindle, and Audible versions. I also have some downloadable resources on my website, such as what I call the Anxious Attachment Style Healing Toolkit, which is the essential exercises of healing from my coaching program. It is self-guided. It's got hours and hours of audio and video from some workshops that I've run on healing the anxious attachment style. And you can explore that toolkit by going to crackliffe.com/starter kit, StarterKit. All right, folks, sending love to everyone here. Thank you for your time. I'm very, very grateful.